Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alexis Alvarez. I'm Director of Statewide Training at Florida Legal Services. I'm very excited to be here with you all today. I'm excited to be with you all every day when we get to do training, especially today. Today's topic is very, very important. I think I said this last session, I'll say it again. The first week of May is Lawyer Wellness Week. And I always say a week is not enough, a month is not enough, a year is not enough. And that's why you all are here today, to explore the individual impact of vicarious trauma and self-care strategies, and overall talk about individual vicarious trauma and organizational vicarious trauma. This is brought to you in honor of Lawyer Wellness Week, and really with the goal to give you all like the strategies and the tools and a community to handle the vicarious trauma that we all experience as legal aid warriors. And so with that being said, I'm going to go into some housekeeping announcements. First and foremost, this is being recorded. A copy of the recording will be sent to you via Zoom. It'll be an email from Zoom, not from me, but I'm going to drop my email into the chat. And of course, if you don't see that in your inbox or you have any questions or anything, you can always reach out to me directly via email. Second, this is a webinar series, as I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, know. So we had part 1 on May 10th. This is part 2. We'll have part 3 next week and part 4 the final week in May. This entire webinar series was approved for 5 General CLE credits. However, per the Florida Bar, their rules and their regulations, I will not be providing that CLE code until the end of the final session, which will be the last Wednesday in May. Don't worry. If you miss that session, it will be recorded. You will receive that. And additionally, if you ever need the CLE code or you miss anything, I'm an open door. You can always reach out to me and I'm happy to give you what you need. The final piece of housekeeping announcements, questions and answers. Please put your questions into the Q&A or the chat. We'll do our best to monitor both. If it's something that we can answer during the presentation, if time permits, if we can, we will. If not, we certainly at the end will not be rushing you off and happy to address your questions at that time. So put them in the chat. Don't be shy. I think I said this last time. I know this is a topic that some of us don't like to talk about or that is tough for us to talk about. We're in it together. We're a community together. So please, questions, thoughts, everything, drop them in. And so I think that's the end of the boring housekeeping stuff. I'm going to ask our speakers today to introduce themselves, and we can start first with Angela Downs, who was here with us last week, for those who remember, but I always want to give kudos to my speakers when they're here. So if you could please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself, Angela.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Alexis, for having us for part 2 of our discussion about vicarious trauma and self-care strategies. My name is Angela Downs, and I'm a law professor at UNT Dallas College of Law, where I am Assistant Director of Experiential Education. I also run our conflict resolution class, and also my areas of research are vicarious trauma, self-care, interpersonal violence issues, cultural competency, and also lawyer wellness. So I am delighted to have this opportunity to be with you, and delighted that Janet Fine is with us as well. Janet?
Thank you, Angela, and thank you, Alexis. So I also want to express my absolute delight at being able to be part of this, and also to applaud the work that the training initiative has provided, because to do a whole series of sessions on this is really something that is groundbreaking in the legal arena, but also in many other professional arenas as this issue is starting to take hold and really get the attention that it's due. So I applaud that we have this opportunity to be with you for the entire month of May. I'm sorry to have missed the first session, but I will be joining Angela and all of you for this one, obviously today, and then for the next 2. So my background is I am not a lawyer, but I join as somebody who has been working in the field of victim advocacy for my entire career, 4-decade career, and about half or more of that had been working in the criminal justice system. So certainly very familiar with the legal arenas, both criminal and civil, as they intersect with each other, and also working in the areas of child abuse response through the Children's Advocacy Center model, and doing that work on both a local, state, and national level. I join you from Massachusetts. And like Angela, a lot of the work that I've been doing in more recent years has been focused on this issue of vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress for victim service professionals, but a lot of allied professionals whose work brings them face to face with the trauma of others. So I'm delighted to bring my perspective to our discussion.
Great. And I love that we're having a victim advocate perspective. I think it's really important to have allied professionals join the conversation. So really glad that you're here, Janet. All right, well, let's go ahead and let's get started. Our learning objectives. As a result of this training, we want you as participants to be able to identify individual ways in which vicarious trauma can manifest both personally and professionally. We want you to consider at least 2 individual self-care strategies to address the impact of vicarious trauma. And we also want you to start developing a self-care plan. We think it's really important that you really take the lessons and not just listen to them, but really we want you to have an action item. And so that's why that's so critically important. So let's do just a really brief recap of what we talked about last week. We spent some time talking about the definition of vicarious trauma, which is defined as an occupational challenge for people working and volunteering in the fields of legal services, victim services, law enforcement, and other allied professions. Folks in these fields, because of the continuous exposure to trauma, often have experienced problems with processing and really living with the things that they experience. We also talked about the difference between vicarious trauma and burnout. One of the things I shared was that vicarious trauma is actually can be found in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, under PTSD. Burnout is more related to a special type of work-related stress. And we know that oftentimes with burnout, if you step away from whatever is troubling you with a particular work-related incident and get a fresh perspective, then usually you get the recharging and the rest that you need, and you can come back and then fulfill your duties. We also talked a lot about the research. There's a lot of good research out there that really shows that for those that are in the legal profession and other allied professions, the stress related to vicarious trauma, seeing the traumatic incidents, doing the client interviews, all of the things that are associated with doing the work and doing it well are really impacting. It's reflected negatively in attorneys with the survey that we looked at that really focused on higher higher drinking, risky drinking, also drug use, and also mental health issues. Some of the things that we talked about also to really work to impact, one of the things we talked about was the lack of sleep, and how as lawyers we don't get enough sleep. We're the second most sleep deprived profession. And so we talked about some things that you can do as part of your nightly routine with, first of all, getting enough rest, making sure that you're separating your workspace if you're working remotely from where you actually sleep at night, turning off devices, really unplugging, and just having some things so that you can actually wind down. Because our research shows us that when we don't get enough rest, it affects our cognitive function. Impacts our metabolism, and then we don't have the opportunity for our bodies to recharge. So those were some of the things that we talked about uh, last week. And with that brief recap, we'll go ahead and move forward with our discussion. So Janet.
Yes. So some of having not been with you last week, some of what I wanted to add to the sort of foundational piece is a perspective that has come from the work that I've been doing on two federal national projects focused on this issue. But one of the ways in which I think it's important to what's important to remind ourselves about is a couple of things around the inevitability of our being impacted by our exposure to trauma, our work-related trauma exposure. And these couple of quotes that you'll see in the next couple of slides, I think really help bring that to the fore. So this one, the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. And I often qualify this quote by saying in our respective professions and the kind of work that we do, often we're being asked to walk on water, to try and make things happen that we just don't individually or even collectively have the power to change, or at least change overnight. So I think that is part of what we exacerbates perhaps the impact of our individual exposure to trauma. So the next quote is from, and the next slide is the from one of the gurus around this issue of compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress, Francois Matou, who hails from Canada and has really been a leader in our understanding and recognition and response to vicarious trauma. And she says, clients and patients will not stop needing help and support. Disasters will continue to arise. Children will get sick, trauma will occur. Helping professionals need to continue to explore ways to remain healthy while doing this deeply challenging and rewarding work. And I think one of the things that is worth underscoring there, which we will reflect on as well, is this notion about the positives that we get from the work that we do. So yes, we are indeed going to be impacted in various ways by our exposure to trauma in our work. And at the same time, we are doing deeply challenging and rewarding work and need to hold that up as we continue to deal with the challenges that we face.
Absolutely. And Janet, as I was thinking about this quote in particular, one of the things that struck me is that it is not a one and done, if you will, with the issue of checking in with yourself and needing help and assistance. I think it's something that needs to be an ongoing process for lawyers and staff and other allied professionals. It's got to be something that's kind of incorporated in part of as part of your wellness routine.
Yes.
So I think that's one of the critical things that everyone, all practitioners need to think about. Yeah.
The next slide is a quote from a victim advocate who was part of this multi-year federally funded project called the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit Project. And I think it also is worth looking at because of how much it underscores what has made it difficult to kind of really approach and discuss and be open about these issues. And she said, we need to destigmatize experiencing trauma-like reactions from our work. Many of us do not know how common it is to have reactions to dealing with trauma every day. I think some would view themselves as weak or not good at their job or not cut out for the work in some way. And this needs to be corrected to actually be about having good awareness that there is a problem, having the courage to seek support and follow through, and knowing this actually makes us better at our jobs. So, and this I know that you discussed in the last session, but it's important to think about the fact that we often may day to day say, oh, this was a really stressful day, or this is a particularly stressful experience or particularly stressful case or something of that nature. And stress in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. Oftentimes it keeps us focused and, kind of gets us to deadlines we need to get to. And so there's productiveness. I'm going to just mute for one quick second. Somebody's knocking on my door. Hold on one quick second.
I love it. No, go ahead, and I'll pick it up. And that's just the joy of being on Zoom. But as Janet was sharing with us, it's good to have a little bit of stress. That's what keeps us motivated. When you've got the stress of knowing that you've got to prepare documents for trial, or if you got a trial date looming, that's the good stress. But it's when you are feeling kind of the overwhelming burden of everything that you are doing, and you get to a point where you don't really feel as though there's a way to handle it or navigate it. That's when we start getting into trouble. So as we look at the graphic, it starts kind of in the green zone where, you're inactive, you're laid back, and then it starts getting to kind of optimum stress in that yellow section where there's fatigue. And then you start getting to exhaustion, which is the orange. When you've got too much, it's overload. You've got so much on your plate. And, we talk about it a lot as having those plates spinning. You've got so many things going on. You've got work stresses, you've got family stresses, you've got to get your kids going, and you're trying to navigate all of those things. And then that can lead to burnout, which is the red zone, when you get to anxiety, panic, anger, and then unfortunately, you might get to the point where it's just a breakdown. So that's what we're really wanting you to think about. There is good stress, but we don't want you to get to the point where you're in the red zone.
Yes, and stress like in the middle of a webinar, having somebody knock on your door. So thank you, Angela.
No problem.
And I think with the kind of work that we do, it's cumulative. It's like day in and day out. And I think that's the part that is, sort of pushes the needle toward this notion about, vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress.
Yeah, and I like the illustration with the rocks because you're building, as you said, it's cumulative. We're building. The stress is happening with a lot of the things that are impacting us and that are happening to us as we do this work. I think that's a great illustration.
It is important, and we'll hear this as we talk about some of the self-care strategies, is the notion of injecting some humor and some lightheartedness into our work. But this also does sort of reflect the fact that sometimes it is really hard, and that's why the purpose of these trainings is so important, or having them is so important, is that even when somebody's telling us that we should stop and smell the roses, we find a way to say, like, that's just going to stress us even more. So
I love this one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we've all been at the point where people are telling you, you really need to take a break. You need to relax. You need to get out and enjoy. And you're thinking, I don't even have time for that. You're like, I don't even have time for this conversation.
Exactly.
That's wonderful.
So, and this, you've already discussed, but the notion that I think it was really helpful when the DSM revised its definition of trauma, to broaden it, to understand that the indirect exposure to trauma is a real thing, and that it can often have some of the consequences that direct exposure to trauma has, and that we are well aware of, and in our trauma-informed care with clients, that we talk with them about the ways in which, and understand the ways in which they may be experiencing their lives, the world around them, by virtue of the trauma they've experienced more directly, but our exposure to their trauma on this in this cumulative way. This was very affirming, I think, for people in the various helping professions, to see that, in fact, it can have those kinds of negative consequences if we don't address them. So whatever term you use, and there's many terms that people and in different professional disciplines may use one term or another. Secondary traumatic stress. Law enforcement often talks about critical incident stress and sort of the responses that they need to have in within their departments, or the policies and protocols that are required of them when they are exposed to a significant trauma. Compassion fatigue that sort of emanated from the healthcare arena, and empathic strain, and vicarious trauma. And while there are some distinctions about those terms, really what all of them are talking about is this notion about the emotional residue of the exposure from working with people and being exposed in various ways, shapes, and forms to their trauma narratives, whether it's direct conversation or reading reports or looking at evidence or things of that nature, where we bear witness to the fear and the stress and the anxiety that they have by virtue of the trauma they are experiencing. So this is a diagram that was developed with a number of colleagues that were working on this Vicarious Trauma Toolkit project back several years ago, that was federally funded by the Office for Victims of Crime, and which we'll talk about some more when we talk about organizational impact and response. But after surveying many people around the country from different disciplines, there was some discussion and synthesis of sort of our understanding, or this comprehensive view of vicarious trauma. And it relates back to kind of the quote that I referenced about understanding and appreciating the deep meaning and rewards that come from doing this work. So it sort of provides a sense of there being a spectrum of responses to exposure to the trauma of others. But on this diagram, under spectrum of responses on the left-hand side is sort of the terminology that is used to sort of describe or reflect the negative consequences that can come from our work-related trauma exposure. That middle box that says neutral probably requires a different title, but basically what that means is not that we would not be impacted at all, because we know it's inevitable that we're going to be impacted by our work-related trauma exposure, but it essentially speaks to the fact that with developed skills and self-care strategies and organizational strategies, et cetera, that we can manage our exposure to that trauma. And then on the right-hand side are the terms that have emerged to really reflect the positive consequences that we get from doing our work, like vicarious, as opposed to vicarious traumatization, is the notion about vicarious resilience, where when we get to bear witness also to the ways in which our help or our assistance can help bring about some positive consequence for the client, then we get the benefit, and we able to see some measure of resilience on their part, then we get the benefit of that sort of vicarious exposure to their resilience. And similarly, instead of compassion fatigue, where we're drained of our sensitivities and our compassion for those we're helping, is the notion that what we're contributing to their paths to healing and justice and safety brings some satisfaction, some work-related trauma, some work-related satisfaction, compassion satisfaction. So holding both of those is really important, and being able to figure out ways to kind of manage the potential negative consequences while also holding the positive that we get from the work that we do. And on the very left side of this diagram is this notion about change in worldview. That is also an inevitable part of our work-related trauma exposure. And I'm sure that many of you may be able to really pinpoint the ways in which your view of the world has changed by virtue of doing this work. I think a common expression about that is, that maybe prior to doing this work, we thought the world was essentially a safe place or a humane place, and that people were essentially trustworthy. And now we see a slice of life where we know that that's not true, or not completely true. I know that in working with victims of abuse and violence, that my worldview changed in terms of how I view certain dynamics or circumstances that I may see, even among strangers. Or I know that working with child victims and their families, that I would sometimes see, like at a playground or at a park, a father with a young daughter out for a day of activity. And my first thought might be, I wonder if he's abusing her. That's kind of a piece of a change of worldview. Or wondering when some horrible thing is going to happen to somebody I know or a loved one, or myself, um, because we now have this insight into a slice of life that perhaps we were not exposed to previously. Angela, I imagine you have
Yeah.
also
Oh my gosh. I
noticed
mean,
that as well.
definitely. And I think that is one of the byproducts of this work is that you definitely don't look at the world um, through the same lens. And I know that, as you've illustrated with your examples, Janet, we have all been in those situations where you're looking at, someone just living their typical normal lives, and you're looking at it through a completely different lens based on the work that you are doing. So it's really being the person that has the ability to take that worldview and to not let it stop you in your tracks and to stop you from living your life and to get you so bogged down that you can't function. Because one of the things as I love this illustration, but as I'm looking, at the neutral section, to me that just illustrates that you're going through the motions. You're just, you're trying not to be impacted, but you're just going through the motions. And I know for anyone that does this work, you do this work because you want to help people and because you're passionate about the work. And when you get to that point, you've really got to uh, just look at yourself and to see what you can do to really get toward that vicarious resilience and compassion satisfaction, because that's where we want you to be. Absolutely where we want you to be.
So I think we're going to move into talking briefly about prevalence, which as Angela aptly talked about, sort of the research that has emerged that really speaks to the prevalence of this experience of work-related trauma exposure, but also some common risk factors, and also talk some about some of the ways in which people have described the impact of their work-related trauma exposure, and that's where we'll have a couple of polls for you to respond to.
Okay. The fun stuff. So we know that, obviously lawyers are not alone. There are a lot of allied professionals. And if you look at the list of the professions, as we've talked about, these are all helping professions. And attorneys and legal staff are right there in this list. And, the exposure to multiple traumatic events has a cumulative effect on the severity of negative responses. And so it really does have that impact on you. Um, and I look at attorneys and judges. I know with judges, there has been a recent rise of suicide with judges who are so stressed out that a lot of judicial organizations, as well as bar associations, have really stepped up to really address the mental health for the judiciary. Because if you think about it, who can the judiciary call uh, really if there's something that's impacting them in a negative way? They have to have a certain persona. And so it's I'm glad to see that's happening. But we're in good company as lawyers with other helping professionals.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that struck me about looking at this list, and it's not certainly not an exhaustive list. I think within any of these categories or first responders, there's all kinds of other professional positions or disciplines that are certainly dealing, whether it's uniformly or within the context of their broader jobs, exposed to trauma. And I think part of what it speaks to is in the work that we do is not shouldering the work alone, because no one of these professional disciplines can really respond to all of the needs of the clients that we're serving. So it really does speak to the importance of collaboration, and the importance of not only sharing the burdens of the work with our allied professionals, but also recognizing that we are in good company, that these conversations can happen with others outside of our individual agencies or professions, because it's impacting lots of other people doing this important work. So these are some of the common risk factors, certainly not an exhaustive list, but some of them are they're inextricably linked, I think, like on both the personal and the professional side. They're not mutually exclusive. But on the personal side, people who have had their own trauma histories can be more at risk for vicarious trauma. The qualifier about that is sometimes people who have had their own trauma histories and experiences and have developed good coping strategies and develop their ability to rebound or be resilient in the face of their trauma histories can actually be a protective factor for them in the face of their work-related trauma exposure. So it can be both a risk factor, but also a protective factor. Certainly, people who are younger, and that sort of dovetails on the professional side there, where you see early career. So people who haven't really had the sort of depth and breadth of experience in their work and to know, or in life in general, by virtue of their age, to be able to develop some of the coping skills that might be necessary to
Yeah, I mean,
address the
and Gina,
impact.
think about the beginning of your career. I think at the beginning of my career, the things that probably would have had me very, very upset, I look back on those things and say, oh my gosh, that was nothing. But I didn't have, the professional maturity at that time. I was still learning. I was still growing professionally. So that definitely is something that you get over time.
Absolutely. Um, and and also the notion about social isolation. If people are in their personal lives feeling socially isolated or don't feel like they have an adequate support system that they can draw from, or a support system that they can share these kinds of things with. And that sort of also dovetails on the professional side with perhaps insufficient supervision or peer support. So again, they're not mutually exclusive, these two lists. They actually sort of coincide with each other in various ways. But also you'll see on the professional side where there may be inadequate orientation and training and resources to do the work, or a high percentage of trauma in somebody's caseload, which for these professions, your profession, ours, is really sort of almost 100% of the client caseload. And by inadequate orientation and training, it may be that there's orientation and training for doing the work and for kind of the policies and procedures and scope of the work and scope of responsibilities and all of that. But I think what we would suggest, which when we talk about sort of organizational impact and response, is to incorporate an understanding and a recognition around this issue of vicarious trauma early on, from point of orientation, even hiring, and then
Absolutely.
orientation and training, so that it becomes part and parcel of what people know right from the get-go.
And I want to go back because one of the things that you've highlighted, as we're talking about this under the personal, is that social isolation. I can't even talk today, an inadequate support system. We talked about kind of the rise in loneliness that a lot of Americans are facing. And we talked about the recent report from our Surgeon General, where they said that even though um, we are more active on social media, that it's almost a false negative. It's kind of a fear of missing out. We're putting our best face forward, but we're not having those social interactions. And so, a lot of that is coming out of COVID. A lot of it is just more access to social media, but that's a real thing that folks are going through. And it's spanning from, the 18 to 25 is the highest group, and then the 65 and up are the two groups that are really at issue. And as we continue to age as a society, the prediction is that we're going to see more loneliness really kind of taking over unless we build in safety nets and really look at this as a real issue. So I'm glad that that's something that we've included, because it's a real risk factor that we really need to take extremely seriously.
And I think sometimes that social isolation, I'm sure you would agree with this experience, is that when you're with people who don't do the kind of work that we do, there's a tendency to really just, sort of veer away from any of those kinds of conversations or discussions, either for fear of sort of injecting a negative piece of conversation or treading on people's positive views of the world and not wanting to kind of talk about this negative slice of life that we deal with on a regular basis. And that can also feel sort of socially isolating. So even if you're with others in a support network, you may be this important part of who you are and what you do is something that is just sort of kept quiet or kept to ourselves. So that's something that is worth noting and worth considering when we think about our own self-care plans and how we get the support that we need. So the next, I think last time too, when we think about our day-to-day work experience, that is really enough of an occupational hazard in and of itself. But then we think about being in this broader context around dealing with a lot of upheaval in our world, in our communities, certainly having dealt with and continuing to deal with the impact of COVID-19, injustice and inequities in our systems, in our communities, that we are hopefully reawakening to and really reckoning with. Natural disasters that we hear about that cause such devastation and destruction, and that whether they're in our communities or elsewhere, we're being exposed to visual images of those and sort of the human stories that come out of those. Mass violence, the same, and media exposure, which we'll talk about briefly in a little while. But all of that is sort of shrouding us in a broader context, in addition to the day-to-day work that we're doing.
And there's new research, Janet, that talks about injustice and inequity, really looking at it from those that are disproportionately exposed to it, those minority populations who are constantly being exposed to injustices, inequities. There's research that shows that it affects health, your mental health, your physical health, and that over time it can really, affect your heart and other things that are happening with your body. So there's some really, there's now some research really to back up that there is a through line with being exposed to these things, that it can really affect you. And they're defining these disproportionate communities is, Hispanic, Black, Native populations and first world populations. Also, they're looking at class. So not just race, but also class and socioeconomic. So there's emerging research to say that this is an impact as well. So I'm excited to see where that information is going to go and where it's going to take us as far as really changing the conversation.
So we're going to get into taking a look at some of the effects or common effects of our work-related trauma exposure, which certainly mirrors a lot of what we know about the direct trauma that clients experience. But I think as we look at, and then we have a couple of polls for you, as we look at this issue of the effects that we may experience, I'd ask that you think about, what crisis trauma related details, even in, within the last few days or past week or something, did you hear about, read about, respond to? And then after hearing, thinking about after hearing or reading about survivors, victims, narratives, experiences, lived experience, how often do they run through your mind? Once a day, several times a day, at night when you're trying to fall asleep. And how many hours did you spend talking to people in crisis? And what kinds of emotions did you feel like you were fielding from them and responding to? And what, if any, type of exposure have you had that was a personal trigger for you? So the next slide is going to give us a sense of what some of the personal impacts are. I think it's, and we'd ask that you maybe take a few minutes to examine this list. It's certainly not an exhaustive list of some of the common effects in each of the domains listed on the left-hand side of this chart, which are areas that we know clients experience the impact of direct trauma: physical, emotional, behavioral, spiritual, cognitive, and social or relational. And maybe take a minute or two to look at this list and individually take note of the number of things that resonate for you, and in particular, which categories you're realizing you are finding some of these common effects to be sort of speak to you. And then the poll will just ask about responding to which of the categories you sort of resonate for you about the impact that you may be reflecting on. So maybe take a minute to look at this list and consider the areas of impact that you may be experiencing. And then we'll move to the poll.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move to the poll.
Okay. So that would be the signal to launch the first poll.
Let me get on it. My moment is here.
Thank you.
There you go. You should be able to see the poll now. Let me know when you want it to stop, and then I can share the results.
Okay.
Great.
And as you see, select all that apply.
Oh, wow. Getting some good results.
Maybe we've hit the end of responses, perhaps.
I think
Um,
so.
And then I'm going to share the results now.
Okay.
Can you see them?
Yes.
Perfect. Let me know when you want me to take this down as well.
Okay. So it's pretty compelling, I think, Angela.
It certainly is.
And I think it's helpful. We partly wanted to do this kind of poll to see that you are in good company with your colleagues in terms of the variety of ways in which we're impacted. Perhaps some more than others. You that resonated for you in looking at those lists, but that there are in all of these categories and perhaps others that maybe you didn't see listed, that there's really a significant amount of impact, and it seems telling that you identified and were able to recognize and share the significant emotional impact that the exposure to the trauma in your work brings. Um, any
Wow. And
other thoughts, Angela? Yeah.
absolutely. I am, when I look at emotional as being, kind of the largest category that resonated with the participants, and emotional being defined from the previous slide as being powerlessness, numbness, anxiety, disillusionment, safety concerns, depression, hopelessness, and unpredictability. To me, I think that is a call to action, to really let's figure out what we can do, particularly with emotional being high, and then social relational being kind of the second highest.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And I think that relates back to that notion that we both highlighted about social isolation and
Hmm.
need for a
Hmm.
support network too. That oftentimes when we're dealing with those feelings of powerlessness and hopelessness, that is something that we need to be able to reach out and get support around. Um, because we not only need to think about strategies that help us to recognize that what we do have power and control over, but also to deal with the really difficult emotional issues that it brings about for us, that change in worldview, and also some of those negative consequences.
Absolutely. All right. So I guess
Okay.
we can stop sharing, and let's
Yeah.
keep on with our conversation.
Okay. So this, and again, not mutually exclusive, the list that you just saw, and this list that is some examples of professional impact. So even using the example of powerlessness and hopelessness, sometimes we feel that in the context of the institutional structures within which we
Hmm.
work, that we can't always walk on water the way we're maybe wanting to or expected to. So take a look at these lists and the categories, see what resonates for you in these lists. Take note of them. And then the next poll will again ask you to respond to the categories that resonate for you in terms of professional impact.
Okay. All right. So are we ready for the poll?
Yes, let me grab it. 1 second.
Okay. Thank you.
My pleasure. All right, launch. Same
Love
thing.
it.
Let me know when you want it to be taken down and when the results to be shared.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And again, select all that apply.
Okay. Wow.
Mm.
Yeah. So we're seeing, morale. I guess, can we end the poll, Alexis?
Of course. Here we go.
Yeah,
And results shared.
absolutely. Thank you.
You want them down.
So it looks like morale is really on the high end. And that was a decrease in confidence, negative attitude, apathy, dreading work, trouble remembering the purpose. So yeah, then performance is pretty, no, not too far behind.
Yeah, and interesting on the interpersonal side, because
Hmm.
that really speaks to being that social isolation, being detached or
Absolutely.
withdrawn from coworkers, or, perhaps it's showing up in impatience or conflict where there hadn't been conflict before. And the notion that in order to do this work, collaboration is so key and so important as a protective factor, and yet that is what can get diminished in our work environment, in our work experience.
Yeah. So I think these are good indicators. So now that we've done these two polls, what can we do
Hmm.
to kind of move forward?
Okay.
So do you want to talk a little bit about the professional quality of life assessment? It's just such a great tool.
Yes, and you see the URL here that you can go to. It is a self-administering survey that really helps to underscore where you are getting satisfaction in your work, or where you are finding negative impact or diminished quality of life in your professional work. So, sort of taking some of the things that we just talked about in the last few slides, and being able to respond, and not just one time, because things really change over time, but to be able to individually take a look at your professional quality of life. Where are you finding satisfaction? Where are the gaps? Where are things really sort of feeling negatively impactful? And it's a very easily administered survey, and it can really tell you where you are experiencing both compassion, satisfaction with your work, but also where some of those gaps are that may need require some attention.
So it's a great tool, really great tool. So these are some, excuse me, some self-care strategies that we want to talk to you about. Taking regular vacations, work and computer free. This can be really, really challenging for type A personalities like me, to be away from a computer and not responding to email can be really difficult. One of the things that I will do is if I'm on vacation with my family, they will give me 1 hour of the day of my choosing that I can devote to email. When that hour is done, they will take my device and put it in the hotel safe if we're staying at a hotel, and I've got to be fully present. But you've got to unplug. You've got to step away from this work in order to remain healthy. If you can't take a vacation, take a staycation. Um, every single city that we live in has a lot of wonderful cultural and other festivals and things going on, and get to know your city. Get out and really just enjoy the city where you are, but pretend like you're a tourist in your hometown. You've also got to exercise, you've got to move, you've got to stay healthy, eating and sleeping. We talked about sleep during our last session together, and it's really such a critical part of your healthy routine. Also, taking deep breaths throughout the day, breathing. If you notice that when you get upset or if you are anxious, your breath becomes shallow and labored. And a lot of times, if you'll slow down your breath and just take a moment, it'll calm you down and it'll help you refocus. Also, you've got to set clear work boundaries. If someone is sending you emails at 3 o'clock in the morning, please don't respond. I'm hoping that you won't respond because your cell phone will be turned off on do not disturb or in another room. But you've got to have clear work boundaries. You've got to have activities and hobbies outside of work. You've really got to figure out what it is that you like. If you like to read, if you like to bird watch, whatever it is, really invest in yourself and to really take on these things. One of the things that I loved when Ketanji Brown Jackson was being interviewed, she said one of the things that she really enjoyed were the yarn arts. And so she's a knitter. And I thought, you know what? I don't know that I'll be a knitter, but isn't that a wonderful hobby for her? She can kind of take her knitting instruments and knitting needles with her and her yarn, and she can create. And she said for her, it was a creative outlet. Also, connecting with family, friends, and community. That's what we've been talking about with that isolation. You've got to have a network of folks. You've got to have a village, and that can be through however you want to build that community. Reflections, taking time to really reflect on the work that you're doing. A lot of times journaling can be really helpful to put your ideas on paper, and then they can kind of stay on paper once you kind of get them out. You can also talk about what's going on with friends, family, supervisors, and other colleagues who understand. Also, if it gets to the point where you think you need to speak to someone that has training, you can seek counseling. We would encourage you to find someone that has the skill set of working with those that are working with trauma folks, just because it's a special school of knowledge, and you need someone that's versed really and can help you navigate that space.
Yeah.
So Janet, did I leave anything else out?
Yeah, well, I think we have a few
we've got a
more
few
suggestions, but but maybe, as you spoke about sort of that the knitting or other kinds of activities. I think sometimes we feel the pressure to kind of take on a hobby that maybe we don't feel particularly skilled at or whatever, but there are lots of ways in which being creative or being in nature and seeing the beauty in the world, especially now as spring is here and flowers are blooming, allergies are raging.
Yeah.
But being able to, it doesn't require that we're all good artists or musicians or whatever, but we can also appreciate those things.
Oh my gosh, no.
And
Yeah.
I think that was an excellent example for that reason.
Yeah, absolutely. Some other strategies, mindfulness practice, really getting into a space where you meditate, journaling, yoga practice, really focusing on moving your body, humor or laughter. And, we're not talking about kind of dark humor, but really, just things that make you laugh, that are separate and apart from the work that you're doing. And, I like the example, it's, for some folks, it's a good pie in the face. Whatever it is that makes you laugh, there's nothing like a good belly laugh to really, kind of chase some of those things and to take care of yourself. And also gratitude, really being thankful. And, sometimes it's just finding that one thing that you are thankful for. And, I can breathe, I can move, whatever it is. But just finding that center of gratitude. There's science that says when we are grateful, that compounds. We have more to be grateful about. And it really shifts our focus, and it helps us not only as a coping strategy, but it helps to change our worldview. So a gratitude practice is something that can really change your perception.
And I think some of these things are things that we may do on a regular basis, but we're not necessarily thinking about them as self-care strategies. And this notion about gratitude, and I agree, I've appreciated seeing some of the research that says that being in a state of gratitude is really something that can be protective, certainly in the face of the kind of work that we do. And that can be, sort of starting the day with being very intentional about recognizing what we're grateful for at the end of the day. And I see, in the chat, this notion about, which I think is an excellent point, about finding that higher satisfaction.
Hmm.
It sort of directly correlates to the worry and the concerns that we have about clients and all of that. And I think that notion about bookending days where we recognize what we have control over and what we don't have control over, and recognizing what we're grateful for, what happened during the day that we feel was an accomplishment, and being able to be very mindful about those things and being able to recognize them and acknowledge them. The gratitude, excuse me, the gratitude for ourselves in the work that we do, but also being able to act intentionally and very concretely express gratitude to others, whether it's a colleague or the client or a supervisor or people in our personal lives, et cetera. That sort of, those small acts of gratitude are what put us in that state of gratitude that can be a real protective factor.
Absolutely. All right, so let's talk about the Wellbeing Toolkit for Lawyers. This is a great resource. Um, and it was actually developed by the American Bar Association, and it really breaks down looking at creating a healthy workplace. So looking at psychosocial, physical, personal, and then that sense of community that we've been talking about. It's a great tool. The information is there. Um, and it has a lot of wonderfully detailed strategies that you can incorporate. Um, so it's a wonderful tool. And these are some of the other components, really defining lawyer well-being. It's really a continuous process in which lawyers strive to thrive in each dimension of their lives. So really looking at how are you doing emotionally, what's going on occupationally, cultivating personal satisfaction and growth and enrichment in work, as well as financial stability, intellectual, engaging in lifelong learning. Obviously, lawyers and other allied professionals, we like to learn, we like to grow. So making sure that you have an environment that really fosters that intellectual growth. Also spiritual. You've got to develop a sense of meaningfulness and purposefulness in all aspects of your life. And I think that speaks to the kind of the higher, the comment in the chat about really kind of that higher focus with the work. Also physical, ensuring that we have some physical activity happening, and then social, those social connections, making sure that you have that well-developed support network that can really lift you up and support you when you need them. So lots of really great information there in the Wellbeing Toolkit.
And those really mirror the categories that we were talking about a little while ago, to really think about all of those different aspects, being very cognizant of all those different aspects in our own individual lives. Where do we have strengths? Where might we have some gaps? Where can we lean on others? Where can we share with others, personally, professionally, that will help to promote our own resilience? And this we mentioned earlier about a few times about sort of our exposure to the media. And I know I am, full transparency, guilty as charged with not really following this in a way that would be really healthy. And sometimes,
Janet, it's a work in progress.
Yes.
It is absolutely a work in progress.
Absolutely. And, we feel like certainly in the work that we do and the way in which we engage in the world, we want to be abreast of all kinds of things that are going on in the world. But much of which we're exposed to in the media is quite overwhelming and quite pervasively concerning and traumatizing. And And yet we're drawn often by virtue of the, I sometimes talk with some of my colleagues who've been doing this work for a long time, and we talk about being trauma junkies, that we're drawn to some of the pain and trauma and fear that is emanating in our world, but also in showing up in very clear ways in our media. So Angela, you already spoke about some of these things, but the ways in which we need to kind of be able to be much more intentional and mindful about how much we're exposed to, and how to limit our exposure to media and avoiding those media rabbit holes that we can go down, needing to read yet another article and another article and another article about some horrific act of, inhumanity, using trusted sources. Angela, very aptly described the notion about protecting sleep and the importance of sleep, and being able to be very intentional about what we allow ourselves to be exposed to. So I don't know if there are some other thoughts about that that you have from your experience, Angela.
I really think you have got to, and I love the illustration at the top where it talks about you wake up feeling okay, and then you immediately grab your phone to check the news. So maybe instead of grabbing your phone to check the news, maybe you're playing just some calm music or whatever gets you going in the morning before you look at the news. But really just being deliberate about how you're starting your day, and kind of what we're putting in to our into our systems, I think is so critically important. This next one, I love this, and Janet, I'm going to get you to probably take the lead on it, but I'm just going to say that I have started incorporating this 3-minute breathing space with my students, and they love it. They absolutely love it.
Yeah, and the previous one about the media toxicity and this one on the left on this slide is among the many really great resources from the TEND Academy, which was founded and directed by Francois Matou, whose quote we started the session off with. There's some wonderful, wonderful downloadable resources on that website. But these are ways in which, when we feel like we don't have the time to take care of ourselves in our own personal time and during the day, during the work day, these are things that are actually doable if we're intentional and mindful about. So 3 minutes, we should be telling ourselves we can take this 3-minute breathing space. And very easy instructions. I know I'm somebody who has struggled with the notion of devoting time to meditation or things of that nature, but 3-minute breathing space, I can grab onto that. This other one, the square breathing, is, to have this posted, and we could certainly provide these in PDF form to be shared, but to have them posted on your desk or in small form on your computer or something that reminds you about the importance of breathing, and when you're in a particularly stressful moment, to just do a very brief breathing exercise is so key.
Absolutely. I've actually printed them out in kind of smaller sized and given them to my class so that they can put them on their phones, like on the back of their
excellent
phones.
Idea.
And they really love that, as a way. Oh, this is another great.
If only this was available to us and that was all that was necessary. But actually, we're hoping that some of the strategies that we've mentioned are ones that you feel you can explore to find the right ones for your own individual health and wellness toolboxes. And that was going back to kind of our hope, was that some of the things that we talked about, even if it's one or two, can be considered as part of your own self-care toolbox or self-care plan.
Absolutely. So as you're reflecting on your self-care, these are some considerations. For whom do you draw inspiration? Do you stay connected with those individuals? Who are the people that really inspire you? How do you find and maintain meaning in your work? For whom do you regularly seek, from whom, excuse me, do you regularly seek support? And do you currently use self-care strategies that you find helpful? Do you exchange ideas about self-care with each other? So really ensuring that you're bringing in your colleagues, bringing in your network to really talk about self-care. What are you doing that's working for you? Wow, that sounds like a great idea. Let me try that. I know during our last conversation, someone said that they use a lavender lotion as they're getting ready for bed. And I said, what a wonderful routine and almost ritual to know that when you put that lotion on, it's time for you to start thinking about going to sleep. So what are you doing? But really giving self-care the justice and the focus that it needs. And I know we've heard a lot about self-care. It's kind of one of the buzzwords that we hear a lot about, and it's been watered down, but really taking it seriously, not just on the, I'm going to, go and sit under a tree, but really doing something that's going to impact you and your health with self-care.
And I would say with the last question there, do you exchange ideas about self-care with each other? I'd probably add to that and say, are there certain self-care strategies that you can join others in doing?
Mm-hmm.
And, sort of building, sort of avoiding that social isolation and considering some of the self-care strategies as a social opportunity.
So some more support among colleagues. We know it takes a village. You've got to be alert for individual signs and symptoms. They're often very subtle. Is someone a little bit more irritable than they used to be? Are they quick to get angry? Are they emotional? Or do you have a colleague, excuse me, who's crying a lot more? And then think about how you want to be supported. What are the things that if you were in their shoes, you would want someone to do for you? And then talk to colleagues, talk to your colleagues, have that communication, and then you can also talk to your supervisor. I know that Florida Legal Services has really identified that this is something that's important to the organization. So I know that any of the supervisors would be glad to talk and to help brainstorm about assisting a colleague who might be in need.
And I think when we see those subtle signs, or maybe not so subtle sometimes, the sort of irritability or conflict that may arise, or communication issues or problems, et cetera, it's an opportunity to get curious about whether it's related to overload of trauma exposure, and an opportunity to raise the question where people may feel, perhaps they're still working on ways to feel comfortable raising these issues, or maybe, just to reflect back that that's a possible consequence or possible issue that may be going on. Opening those conversations and those avenues for discourse around this issue makes it ultimately, it is a work in progress, but it makes it ultimately much more integrated into how we do business.
Absolutely. So these are some of the resources that we shared. We can also send resources from the TEND Academy. Those are just really easy to understand and easy to really incorporate into your self-care strategy toolbox. So these are some great resources for you. And then at this time, we'll take any questions or comments. You can put those in the chat. During our next session, we're going to be talking about organizational responsibility for addressing vicarious trauma. So we're excited to have that conversation with you next week.
Awesome. Yes. Thank you so much, Angela and Janet. It's such a pleasure to have a safe space to learn about this topic and to feel like we can grow within this topic. So I just wanted to say that. And before I keep going, I'll let Angela go into the what's on the screen right now.
All right. Thank you so much, Alexis. This is the evaluation and QR code. We do ask that you complete this survey and that you give us feedback. We're always looking to improve the information that we share, and make sure that we are providing you with information that will serve you best. So please take a moment. There's also the URL that you can also go to, but please complete the evaluation for us. We certainly would appreciate it. And again, this has really been a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. And we look forward to having and continuing our conversation. Janet?
Yeah, I echo the sentiments, and also see that there at least was one comment that said that you will be using some of the examples provided, which is great to hear, and hopefully they're accessible and realistic options for you, and also the encouragement to share them with your colleagues, your friends and colleagues.
Well, thank you so much, Angela and Janet. The comments that are coming through on the chat are many thanks. There was a comment that we did talk about with the higher satisfaction and how that leads to the higher worry. And, Julie, who put that comment in, I resonate with you wholeheartedly. So, with no additional questions, and I'm just going to go into some housekeeping and say, those of you who are registered for this webinar, you should automatically be registered for the upcoming webinar that's going to be on Wednesday, the 24th. As always, if you're not or you're not sure, you can always reach out to me directly. And before we sign off, I just want to say thank you again to Angela and Janet. I know most of you in the training world know this because I say it often, but I am a former public defender. I was a public defender. And I wish I had known a lot of this stuff in the beginning.
Yeah.
I think it would have increased my longevity and really kept me in that fight. So for all of you out there who are feeling similarly, know you're not alone. And, Angela and Janet, thank you for spearheading this conversation and bringing it to our legal aid community.
Absolutely. Completely our pleasure. Thank you so much for having us.
Yes. And we will see you next week.
Absolutely.
See you all next Wednesday. Have a wonderful rest of your week, a wonderful weekend. And I'm looking forward to being in community with you all again then.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.